virtually every government in the world is staffed by people who have received the nod from big corporations to be there. The US, of course, is a classic case, but Australia is a case too.
The mainstream supporters of globalisation are very keen to portray people who oppose corporate globalisation as being protectionists and nationalists and so on, but I don't think that that's the only alternative.
I don't think it's right to just say we'll only think about Australia and Australia's workers. I actually think we've got a fundamental responsibility in terms of workers across the world.
We're not under any illusion that the bosses of manufacturing are any better than many other bosses, but all we are saying is we want our members to have a job. But it's not on the basis of saying we should have the jobs and don't give it to the third world. There's not a racist policy. It's about building relationships with our brothers and sisters in other countries in manufacturing and lifting their standards.
Even when tariffs were very high, the money was thrown at the owners of those companies, but it still wasn't the case that they were workplaces that were good workplaces. It still wasn't the case that there wasn't exploitation in those workplaces.
The solution is not to look back to the 1950s when the capitalist economy was governed by high tariff wars and protectionist barriers. It's to look forward to restructuring the way that the world's economy works, to have it globalise the things that we want to globalise, like equal access to medicines and such things.
Our policy is fair trade, not free trade.
And what we say about a fair market is that you have to take into account not only economic circumstances, they're important, but so too are the elements of social commitment and commitment to the environment.
The reality is, though, that in a lot of these countries, such as Indonesia, and Indonesia is a good example, they have no rights. No right to collectively organise, there's no legislation to stop child labour.
You walk into these workplaces and factories and this is, kids working in here.
When workers in Indonesia, are fighting for union rights, then Australian unions, Australian activists have to get behind that fight.
If labour movements in first and third world countries united, they would be far, far more powerful, far more able to affect change than they are at the moment.
Workers in any country, in my limited experience overseas, will fight back when they're being ripped off. You only have to look at what's going on in Korea at the moment, where the workers are fighting back in a very militant way. And I don't think they're a threat to our jobs, the workers in Korea, far from it. But what I do think is a big threat is the free market policies of some of the transnationals that only want to go and locate somewhere where the workers have no rights and where they can be basically forced into prison-type conditions.
Examples of workers being harassed, intimidated and killed for the fact that they've tried to organise effectively amongst workers. There's been rape, there's been assault, there's been workers locked into workplaces that are unsafe and unable to escape and are consequently burnt to death. I mean, this is the most gross exploitation of humanity to set up, what are factories, churning out clothing for first world countries, and the conditions that those factories are being set up under literally mean that people die.
Workers' lives are not for profit. Bullshit.
In Australia now we used to have a footwear and clothing industry which we don't have. Why don't we have it? It's because it's gone overseas. Why has it gone overseas? Because it can be produced cheaper on slave labour. And how do we benefit from that? We can buy shoes, whatever it is, at maybe 120, I don't know what the price of the shoes are, when probably if you paid those workers a proper wage, it would be $500. So that's how we benefit.
That's disgusting! What's outrageous?
What is called the free market is actually a system which allows big corporations to plunder the resources of third world countries and the labour of third world countries and plunder the labour and resources of first world countries and make super fabulous, unimaginable profits for themselves and basically keep them, and that's called legal. That's legal under the free market.
The World Trade Organization legalises large forms of protectionism by the big countries. the US and Europe's massive subsidies to their agricultural sectors, which prevent poor third world farmers exporting their produce to those markets, is legal under WTO rules. The trade agreement in intellectual property rights, TRIPS, is a massive form of protectionism because it protects the rights of multinationals to keep patents on new forms of technology for 20 years, even in cases where the patents are based on forms of knowledge which have been known by third world peoples for millennia. So it shouldn't be presented as though the alternative is free trade or protectionism, because both of those policies are encapsulated in what the big countries are forcing through the World Trade Organization. It's more a case of what are our package of policies to represent the working people of the world that will benefit them, rather than let us simply follow the policy advocated by one section of big capital against another.
I think that there would be other kinds of ways in which to organize one's trade and economic sort of opportunities, and that might involve different rules for rich countries and poor countries. But they've always been different rules. But let us now sort of have the rules so that they benefit the poor countries rather than being the other way around all the time.
I think as the anti-corporate movement grows in power, there will be increasing attempts to co-opt it. And I think institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are starting to feel the heat. And they will start to, I think, open the negotiation table.
I know that came forward at the Davos Counter Summit. There was a lot of debate, in particular about whether it's possible to have social clauses inserted into the World Trade Organisation agreements, or whether actually we want to get rid of the World Trade Organisation.
All of these institutions now are responding to resistance. They're all trying to re-legitimise themselves. You see corporations doing it the whole time, talking about corporate citizenship.
Some of the publications they bring out are excellent in their philosophy and the way they describe their responsibilities, but in practice that never happens.
How can climate change campaigners, for example, be fooled by BP's new "we're going into renewable energies" push, when the fact of the matter is that they spent more money designing their new logo last year than they did on researching renewable energies?
Those attempts to re-legitimise these institutions, I see that optimistically. I see that as a product of resistance. And what that for me suggests is that only if we keep the resistance up and intensify the resistance will we see any meaningful transformation in the future.
The people united will never be defeated. Whose world? Our world. Whose streets? Our streets. Whose world? Our world. Whose streets? Our streets.
Finance Capital has imposed a GST mainly on the 1.2 million people who run small businesses, and they're enraged beyond belief.
Economic rationalism is what runs Australia. It means misery for us. It also means we have to fight back. We have to organise. The unions are very important in this. We have to say to the unions, we want to fight together to stop the bloody misery that John Howard, economic rationalism and the stock exchange are giving us.
There's a big demonstration, but the next one's going to have to be bigger. We're going to have to get the trade unions on side. There's going to be a big stoppage because, as we've seen here, the cops are very physically strong.
Overwhelmingly, the people who have been involved in Seattle and Washington and Prague and so on, that their aim has never been to cause violence. I think their aim has been to confront those institutions and to shut them down. But overwhelmingly, it has been the police and the authorities that have instituted the violence.
The affront of the fact that workers, or in S11's case, that people stopped them going about their business is so offensive to capital that the response to that is a violent one. And so government thinks, well, here's business, we've got to keep business here. We better make sure that if they're affronted by something, that we're affronted by it too. And then we better use our forces to stop it happening.
There have been some small groups that have advocated pumping up the heat a bit, but the general consensus in the movement is that